As we watched in awe, the light seemed to take shape, flowing out from the statue like liquid gold. It formed what appeared to be a protective dome over the congregation, particularly intense around the children. The temperature in the cathedral rose perceptibly, like stepping into a warm embrace on a cold day. The attackers began firing wildly into the light, their coordinated tactics disintegrating into panic. The sound of automatic weapons fire filled the cathedral, but something miraculous was happening. The bullets seemed to slow and then stop in mid-air, before dropping harmlessly to the ground like rain. I watched in disbelief as round after round simply fell away before reaching their intended targets. The sound of gunfire was muted, as if coming from a great distance, though the men were only feet away. It was as if the light was absorbing the sound, transforming the chaos of violence into a profound silence that allowed me to hear, for the first time, soft music that had no earthly source, a melody so beautiful it brought tears to my eyes. "This isn't possible," the leader screamed, emptying his magazine toward the statue, his earlier confidence shattered. As his weapon clicked empty, he threw it aside and pulled a handgun from beneath his jacket, continuing to fire futilely. "What is this? What are you doing?" he shouted at me, as if I were somehow orchestrating what was happening. I wasn't. I was as much in awe as everyone else, tears streaming down my face as I witnessed what could only be described as divine intervention. 23 years of priesthood had taught me to see God's hand in the everyday miracles of life. Births, reconciliations, deathbed conversions, but nothing had prepared me for this visible manifestation of heavenly protection. What happened next defies rational explanation, and yet hundreds of witnesses saw it, myself included. The light around the Virgin Mary's statue intensified until it was almost blinding, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. Those of us watching could just make out what appeared to be a female figure within the light, not the statue itself, but a living presence. She was both familiar and transcendent, resembling traditional depictions of the Blessed Mother, yet more real than any artwork could capture. Her features were difficult to discern clearly, as looking at her was like trying to gaze at the sun, but her presence emanated peace and authority in equal measure. She wore a mantle of deepest blue that seemed to contain galaxies within its folds, and her hands were outstretched toward the congregation in a gesture of protection. No words were spoken, at least none that could be heard with human ears, but a message seemed to resonate within the cathedral, felt rather than heard. "You shall not harm my children." The impact on the gunmen was immediate and profound. The leader staggered backward as if physically struck. The second attacker dropped to his knees, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. The third simply stood motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The gunmen dropped their weapons as if they had suddenly become searing hot. They clutched their hands, crying out in pain. Their masks couldn't hide their expressions of absolute terror as they confronted something beyond their understanding or experience. The leader tried to run back toward the entrance, but collapsed to his knees halfway down the aisle, his legs seeming to give way beneath him. He covered his face with his hands, weeping uncontrollably, all his earlier aggression dissolving into what looked like genuine remorse. "I see her," he sobbed, all bravado gone. "I see her. Make it stop." What he was seeing, I cannot say for certain. Later, when I spoke with him in prison, he would tell me that in that moment he was shown every life he would have taken, every future he would have destroyed. He saw children growing up without parents, parents burying children, a community shattered by senseless violence, and he saw his own soul, blackened by hatred, but still capable of redemption. The golden light continued to pulse through the cathedral for what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes. It touched every person present in different ways. Mrs. Chen, our organist who had been battling cancer, would later tell me that she felt a warmth pass through her body, concentrated in the areas where tumors had been detected. Her next scan would show them significantly reduced. Eduardo Morales, who had been bleeding from his head wound, found himself completely healed, not even a scar remaining. Kevin, our security guard, experienced a similar miraculous healing of his gunshot wound. But the physical healings, remarkable as they were, paled in comparison to the spiritual transformation that swept through the cathedral. Later, dozens of parishioners would describe experiencing a profound sense of peace and divine love, unlike anything they had known before. Several lapsed Catholics returned to the faith. A few non-believers began instruction in the catechism. Even Dr. Levinson, our Jewish friend, told me that while he remained committed to his own faith, he had seen something that day that transcended religious boundaries. A moment of divine protection, he called it, that belongs to all of us. When police sirens finally wailed in the distance, approaching the church, the light began to recede, flowing back toward the statue like a tide returning to the ocean. As it diminished, normal sounds returned. Weeping, prayers of thanksgiving, the approaching sirens, but the scent of roses lingered, and an unmistakable sense of holy presence remained. By the time the first officers burst through the doors, weapons drawn, the gunmen were lying prostrate on the stained glass windows exploded inward as the first shots rang out. Shards of colored glass rained down on us like deadly confetti, while screams erupted from the congregation. I stood frozen at the altar, the chalice still in my trembling hands, as 3 masked men stormed through the main entrance of St. Michael's Cathedral, assault rifles raised. "Nobody move!" the tallest one shouted, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling of our church in downtown Manhattan. This is what happens when you spread your lies. In that moment, facing the barrel of a gun during the holiest part of the Mass, I was certain I was about to meet God, not in prayer, but in person. What I couldn't possibly know was that this moment of terror would become the most profound testimony to Our Lady's protection I would ever witness. Time seemed to suspend itself as I stood there, the consecrated wine trembling in the chalice I held. The faces of my parishioners reflected pure horror, mothers clutching their children, elderly couples holding each other, teenagers frozen in disbelief. Mrs. Ramirez, our 78-year-old daily communicant, was silently moving her lips in what I knew was the Hail Mary. Beside her, little Emma Parker, only 7 years old, who had just received her first communion the previous month, buried her face in her mother's side. The sunlight streaming through the remaining stained glass windows cast fractured patterns of blue and crimson across the marble floor, the blood of martyrs and the mantle of Our Lady dancing together in light, even as real blood might soon be spilled. The incense from the thurible still hung in the air, its sacred scent now mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. My name is Father Thomas Riley, and I've been a priest for 23 years. Growing up in a small town in Connecticut, I was the second of 4 children in a devout Catholic family. My parents, Michael and Elizabeth, had always instilled in us a special devotion to the Blessed Mother. Every evening, without fail, we would gather in our modest living room to pray the rosary together. My mother kept a small statue of Our Lady of Fatima on the mantel, and fresh flowers were always placed before it, no matter the season. Even during the harshest winter months when snow piled against our windows and the roads were impassable, my father would somehow find a way to bring home at least one fresh bloom for Mary. My childhood was steeped in Catholic tradition. I served as an altar boy from age 7, learning Latin responses before I fully understood their meaning. The parish priest, Father Domenico, an Italian immigrant with hands gnarled from decades of prayer, would ruffle my hair after Mass and tell me, "Thomas, you have the eyes of someone who sees beyond." I didn't understand what he meant then, but his words would return to me many years later. Our town celebrated the Marian feast days with processions that wound through the streets. I remember being entranced by the statue of Our Lady, carried on a platform adorned with flowers, the women of the parish walking behind it, their voices raised in the Ave Maria. These memories aren't just nostalgic reflections. They form the spiritual foundation upon which my entire life would be built. When I was 14, my younger sister Angela was diagnosed with leukemia. The doctors gave her less than a year to live. I can still recall the sterile hospital room where we received the news, the fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over my parents' devastated faces. Angela, just 11, sat on the bed, her already thinning hair falling across her shoulders as she clutched the small rosary our grandmother had given her for her first communion. That night I couldn't sleep. I slipped out of bed and into the family room where my mother's Fatima statue stood. In the moonlight filtering through the curtains, Mary's porcelain face seemed alive with compassion. I knelt before her and made a vow that would alter the course of my life. "Blessed Mother," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, "if you save my sister, I will give my life to your son. I will become his priest and serve him until my dying day." Every night after that, I would kneel beside my bed and beg the Virgin Mary to spare Angela, repeating my promise. I watched as my sister grew weaker, her once vibrant spirit dimming with each round of chemotherapy. My parents aged years in months, their faith tested but never broken. My father, a stoic man not given to emotional displays, began joining me in my evening prayers, his large hand covering mine as we clutched the rosary beads together. 6 months into her treatment, during a routine checkup that we expected would bring more bad news, Angela's doctor entered the room with an expression of bewilderment. The latest tests showed a significant reduction in cancer cells. 2 weeks later, she was in remission. The medical team was baffled, using words like unexpected and unusual and we can't explain it. They credited new treatment protocols and Angela's youth. But I knew. As I watched color return to my sister's cheeks and light to her eyes, as her hair began to grow back and she returned to school, I knew exactly who was responsible for this miracle. My parents knew it too. The bouquet before Our Lady's statue grew more elaborate, and my mother added a small blue candle that was kept perpetually lit. When I entered the seminary at 18, it felt less like a choice and more like fulfilling a promise, a sacred contract with heaven that I had no desire to break. My parents weren't surprised when I told them. My mother simply nodded and said, "She's been preparing you all along." My father, a man of few words, embraced me with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Serve her son well." Angela came to my ordination 13 years later, completely healthy, married with a child of her own whom she had named Maria. When she placed my first priestly blessing on her infant daughter's forehead, the circle felt complete. Our Lady had saved one child, and now I would spend my life bringing her son to countless others. After my ordination, I served in various parishes throughout New England before being assigned to St. Michael's in New York 5 years ago. My journey to New York was unexpected. I had spent 15 years in small to mid-sized parishes, from the fishing community of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I blessed the fleet each spring, to a struggling mill town in Rhode Island, where I worked with families devastated by job losses and opioid addiction. Each assignment taught me different aspects of pastoral care, but none prepared me for the complexities of urban ministry in Manhattan. St. Michael's Cathedral sits at the intersection of cultures and extremes that define Manhattan, surrounded by both towering wealth and desperate poverty. The neo-Gothic structure, built in 1879 by Irish immigrants who scraped together pennies from meager wages, stands as a testament to faith amidst hardship. Its spires reach toward heaven between glass skyscrapers, a stone reminder of eternal promises in a city obsessed with temporal success. Our congregation reflected this diversity. Wall Street executives kneeling beside homeless individuals, tourists alongside multi-generational New York families, all united in faith. On any given Sunday, more than 20 languages could be heard in conversations before and after Mass. The Filipino community maintained a special devotion to Our Lady, organizing monthly processions in her honor that brought vibrant color and profound reverence to our liturgical life. When Cardinal Morrison first called me to his office and mentioned St. Michael's, I thought he was mistaking me for someone else. "Your Eminence," I said, "I've always served in smaller communities. I'm not sure I have the experience for a cathedral parish in Manhattan." The Cardinal, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses, smiled. "The Blessed Mother disagrees with your assessment, Thomas. I've prayed about this appointment, and her name kept coming to my heart. There's something she wants you to do there." I accepted the assignment with trepidation, but trusted in the Cardinal's discernment. My first year at St. Michael's was a steep learning curve, adapting to the relentless pace of city life, learning to navigate parish politics far more complex than anything I'd encountered before, and finding my voice in a pulpit that had hosted some of the most eloquent preachers in the archdiocese. Gradually, St. Michael's began to feel like home. I established a special ministry to the homeless, converting an underused parish hall into a daily soup kitchen that served over 200 people each day. We launched an outreach to young professionals, offering evening lectures on faith and ethics in the modern workplace. Our children's programs flourished, with catechism classes filled to capacity. Throughout it all, I maintained my childhood devotion to the Blessed Mother. The statue of Our Lady in the side alcove became my special refuge during difficult days. It wasn't particularly remarkable artistically, a standard plaster representation of Mary with her hands outstretched in welcome, but something about her expression captured the compassionate gaze I remembered from my prayers as a child. Often, I would slip into the cathedral during quiet afternoons to sit before her, sharing my concerns and seeking guidance. The weeks leading up to that fateful Sunday had been unsettling. Religious tensions in the city had been escalating following a series of controversial political events and international incidents that had inflamed extremist sentiments across the ideological spectrum. Houses of worship of all faiths had reported increased harassment, from hateful graffiti to online threats. St. Eustace. Michael's had received several threatening emails, which we reported to the police, but they assured us these were likely just empty threats, disturbing but common in the current climate. "We're monitoring the situation, Father," Officer Ramirez had told me, "but we've seen an uptick in these messages to churches, synagogues, and mosques throughout the city. Most are just trying to cause fear, not actual harm." As a precaution, we hired a security guard who patrolled during Sunday masses, but he was stationed at the side entrance that morning, nowhere near the main doors, when the attackers burst in. His name was Kevin, a retired police officer with a gentle manner that put parishioners at ease while maintaining vigilance. He had become part of our community, attending coffee hours after Mass and even joining our parish men's group. 3 days before the attack, I had experienced a strange dream that in retrospect seems prophetic. In it, I was celebrating Mass when a powerful storm broke over the cathedral. Rain poured through the roof, but rather than causing panic, the water transformed into cascading blue light that enveloped the congregation protectively. I awoke with the Ave Maria on my lips, and a sense of both foreboding and peace that I couldn't reconcile. That Sunday had begun like any other. I rose at 5:30 for prayer, watched the sunrise from my window in the rectory, and prepared my homily one final time. The early morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the marble floors as parishioners filed in for the 10:30 Mass. The church was nearly full. Almost 300 people had gathered, including many families with children, as it was the final Sunday before the start of the school year. I had just begun the liturgy of the Eucharist, raising the host above the altar, when the first window shattered. Time seemed to slow as I watched the colored glass explode inward, followed immediately by the deafening sound of gunfire and screaming. 3 masked men charged through the main entrance, weapons raised. The security guard from the side entrance rushed in, but was immediately shot in the leg and collapsed near the baptismal font, his blood forming a crimson pool on the white marble. The sounds around me became distorted, as if I were underwater. Children's cries reached my ears as if from a great distance. The grand pipe organ, which had been playing softly during the consecration, fell silent as our organist, Mrs. Chen, ducked beneath the console. The cathedral's perfect acoustics, normally enhancing sacred music and prayer, now amplified every terrified sob and shout. "Everyone on the ground now!" the second gunman shouted, firing a burst into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down as panicked parishioners dropped to the floor. Mothers covered their children with their bodies. Fathers positioned themselves between their families and the attackers. Some people tried to run for the side exits, but stopped when the third attacker fired in their direction, the bullet splintering the wooden pews just inches from an elderly man who fell to his knees in fear. From my position at the altar, elevated by 3 marble steps, I could see the entire horrific scene unfolding. Dr. Levinson, a Jewish cardiologist who had been attending Mass with his Catholic wife for 20 years, was attempting to tend to the wounded security guard despite the danger. A group of Nigerian nuns, visiting from their mission in Lagos, were huddled together in prayer, their white habits creating an island of light in the chaos. A young mother was desperately trying to quiet her infant, whose cries echoed through the vaulted space. I remained standing at the altar, still holding the chalice, my white chasuble suddenly feeling like a target. My vestments, embroidered with gold thread and symbols of the Eucharist, had always represented the dignity of my office. Now they marked me clearly as the priest, the leader, potentially the first target. The consecrated host, which I had just elevated, still rested on the paten beside the chalice. Even in my fear, I was acutely aware that the body of Christ should not be desecrated. The lead attacker pointed his weapon directly at me, his eyes cold through the slits in his black mask. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders, and movements that suggested military training. The other two were smaller, but moved with similar precision, spreading out to control the space, one moving toward the left side of the congregation, the other to the right, a tactical formation designed to prevent escape. "You!" the leader snarled through his mask, his voice carrying a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "You're going to watch what happens when you spread your superstitions in our city." Fear like I had never known coursed through me. My mouth went dry and my legs threatened to give way. My mind flashed to news reports of church shootings, of faithful gunned down during worship. I thought of the seminary, where we had been prepared for so many aspects of pastoral ministry. Theological debates, administrative challenges, counseling the troubled, but never for this moment of raw terror. Nothing in my decades of priesthood had equipped me to face armed men intent on massacre. Yet amidst that terror, a strange calm began to settle over me. The chalice in my hands, though heavy, steadied me. I thought of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing his moment of trial, sweating blood yet accepting his Father's will. I thought of Mary, standing at the foot of the cross witnessing her son's crucifixion, her heart pierced by a sword of sorrow as prophesied. If this was to be my last moment, I wanted to face it with the dignity of faith. "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ and his blessed Mother," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I ask you to put down your weapons and leave this holy place." My words hung in the air, seeming to echo longer than acoustically possible. For the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered in the leader's eyes, visible even through his mask. Then his posture hardened. The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Your imaginary friends can't help you now, Father." He gestured to the shattered windows, the wounded guard. "Where is your protection? Where is your God?" He turned to his companions. "Start with the children. Let's show them what their faith is worth." At those words, several mothers cried out in despair, clutching their children tighter. The congregation, initially frozen in shock, began to stir with desperate energy. A teenage boy lunged toward the nearest exit, but was immediately struck down by the butt of a rifle, his glasses shattering as he crumpled to the ground. One of the gunmen began moving toward the front pews, where a family with 3 young children huddled together in prayer. I recognized them, the Morales family, faithful parishioners whose oldest daughter was preparing for confirmation. The father, Eduardo, moved to shield them, but was struck with the butt of the rifle and fell to the side, blood streaming from his temple. His wife, Lucia, screamed his name, trying to reach for him while keeping her body between the attacker and her children. In that moment of utter hopelessness, I did the only thing I could think of. I placed the chalice carefully on the altar, my hands surprisingly steady. Then I raised both arms high above my head, in the same gesture I used during the most sacred part of the Mass, and began to pray, loudly and clearly, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." My voice carried through the cathedral, strong despite my fear. It felt as if someone else was speaking through me, lending me a courage I didn't possess on my own. The familiar prayer, recited countless times throughout my life, came as naturally as breathing. To my astonishment, voices from the congregation began to join me. First a few, then dozens, then what seemed like everyone. First came Mrs. Ramirez's wavering soprano, then the clear voice of a child. Soon the Nigerian nuns added their melodious tones, followed by deeper male voices from throughout the church. "Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." The prayer spread like a wave, gaining strength with each voice that joined. Even those who weren't Catholic or didn't know the words seemed to hum along, adding to the swell of sound that began to fill every corner of the vast space. The lead attacker shouted for us to be silent and fired another warning shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Plaster dust rained down, covering the altar and my vestments in a fine white powder, but the voices only grew stronger. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." The gunmen looked at each other, momentarily confused by this unexpected response. They had anticipated terror, panic, pleading, not this unified chorus of prayer. The third attacker, the smallest of the 3, took a step backward toward the door, but the leader gestured sharply for him to hold position. As we reached the end of the first Hail Mary, without prompting or direction, the congregation began again. This time even more voices joined, including some I could identify as belonging to non-Catholic regular attendees who must have learned the prayer simply from hearing it so often. Hail Mary, full of grace. We were on our third repetition when something changed in the air of the cathedral. I can only describe it as a shift in pressure, as if the atmosphere itself was being compressed and then released. The hair on my arms stood on end, and a curious warmth began to spread through the space despite the cool September morning. A soft, golden light began to fill the church, not from the windows, which were now mostly shattered, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it might be a strange effect of sunlight through the remaining stained glass, or perhaps dust catching the light in an unusual way. But the quality of this illumination was different. Warmer, more vibrant, almost pulsing with life. It seemed to emanate particularly from a small statue of the Blessed Virgin that stood in an alcove to the right of the altar. This statue had always been special to me since my arrival at St. Michael's. While not particularly valuable or artistically significant, a simple plaster representation from the 1950s, I had always felt drawn to pray before it. Many parishioners shared this devotion, and fresh flowers were always placed at its base. Now the light emanating from it was so bright that I had to shield my eyes, yet it wasn't harsh or painful to look at. It was warm, comforting, like the embrace of a mother. The gunmen noticed it too. Their coordinated movements faltered as they turned toward the source of the light. "What is this?" one of them shouted, his voice tinged with fear for the first time. He fired a shot directly at the statue, but the bullet seemed to slow in mid-air before dropping harmlessly to the marble floor, with a small clink that was audible throughout the now hushed cathedral. The light continued to intensify, centered on the statue but flowing out from it like liquid gold. It formed what appeared to be a protective dome over the congregation, particularly intense around the children. I could see the Morales children bathed in it, their faces transformed from terror to wonder. The injured security guard, Kevin, who had been grimacing in pain, now lay peacefully, the bleeding from his leg wound visibly slowing. The temperature in the cathedral rose perceptibly, like stepping into a warm embrace on a cold day. The scent of roses, fresh and sweet, filled the air, overpowering the acrid smell of gunpowder that had pervaded the space moments before. The attackers began firing wildly into the light, but their bullets seemed to slow and then stop in mid-air before dropping harmlessly to the ground. The sound of gunfire was muted, as if coming from a great distance, though the men were only feet away. "This isn't possible," the leader screamed, emptying his magazine toward the statue. "What happened next defies rational explanation, and yet hundreds of witnesses saw it, myself included." The light around the Virgin Mary's statue intensified until it was almost blinding. Those of us watching could just make out what appeared to be a female figure within the light, not the statue itself, but a living presence that emanated peace and authority in equal measure. No words were spoken, at least none that could be heard with human ears, but a message seemed to resonate within the cathedral. "You shall not harm my children." The gunmen dropped their weapons as if they had suddenly become searing hot. They clutched their hands, crying out in pain. The masks they wore couldn't hide their expressions of absolute terror. The leader tried to run back toward the entrance, but collapsed to his knees halfway down the aisle, weeping uncontrollably. "I see her," he sobbed, all bravado gone. "I see her." "Make it stop!" The golden light continued to pulse through the cathedral for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only minutes. When police sirens finally wailed in the distance, approaching the church, the light began to recede, flowing back toward the statue like a tide returning to the ocean. By the time the first officers burst through the doors, weapons drawn, the gunmen were lying prostrate on the floor, weaponless and unresisting. They offered no fight as they were handcuffed and led away, their eyes vacant, as if they had witnessed something their minds couldn't process. The aftermath was a blur of police statements, medical attention for the wounded security guard and the injured father, and endless questions. How had 3 armed men been subdued without a single casualty? Why had they suddenly abandoned their weapons? What had caused them to surrender without resistance? Those of us who had witnessed the miracle struggled to articulate what we had seen. How do you explain to skeptical police officers that the Mother of God had manifested her protection in a physical way? That bullets had stopped in mid-air? That light had taken the shape of a woman? In the days that followed, media outlets tried to make sense of what had happened. Mass shooting attempt at St. Michael's Cathedral fails, "When attackers inexplicably surrender," read one headline. Theories ranged from a planned surrender to mass hysteria to a gas leak causing hallucinations. The security cameras in the cathedral had all malfunctioned during the exact time frame of the attack, leaving no video evidence of what had transpired. But the 300 witnesses knew what they had seen. In the weeks that followed, attendance at St. Michael's tripled. People came from across the country to visit the statue, an ordinary statue of Our Lady that had been in the cathedral for decades without attracting special attention. Many reported feeling a lingering warmth and peace in its presence. The most remarkable transformation, however, was in the gunmen themselves. I felt called to visit them in prison while they awaited trial. I expected to find anger or at least denial about what had happened. Instead, I found 3 deeply shaken men who could not explain their actions or what they had experienced. The leader, whose name I learned was Marcus, asked to speak with me privately. "I saw her," he whispered, his eyes haunted. "She showed me everything, my whole life, every moment of hatred and anger that led me to that day. But she also showed me mercy." He paused, struggling for words. "I don't expect forgiveness, Father. What I planned to do was unforgivable. But I need you to know that something real happened in that church." Over the next several months, all 3 men requested religious instruction. 2 years later, in one of the most powerful moments of my priesthood, I baptized Marcus in the prison chapel. The man who had once threatened to kill children in a house of God wept as the baptismal waters washed over him, his former hatred replaced by a profound humility. St. Michael's Cathedral has been forever changed by what happened that day. We installed a special shrine around the statue of Our Lady with a simple plaque reading, "Our Lady of Protection." Pilgrims come daily, and many miraculous healings, physical, emotional, and spiritual, have been reported by those who pray there. As for me, my faith in the Blessed Mother's intercession, already strong from childhood, has become the absolute bedrock of my priesthood. I know with certainty that when we call upon Mary in our darkest moments, she hears us. Just as she stood at the foot of the cross, refusing to abandon her Son in his suffering, she stands with us in our moments of trial. The golden light that filled St. Michael's that day has faded from physical sight, but its warmth remains in the hearts of all who witnessed it. It reminds us that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we realize, that divine protection surrounds us even when, especially when, danger is at its greatest. Each night before I sleep, I kneel before a small replica of the statue from the cathedral and pray the same prayer that rose spontaneously from my lips during those terrifying moments. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. And in the silence that follows, I sometimes feel that same warm light just for a moment, assuring me that she is listening. Do you believe that Our Lady still acts in our world today? Has there been a moment in your life when you felt her protection, perhaps in a way you couldn't explain? Share your experience in the comments, and if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that heaven's protection is still active in our troubled world.